everyone. Welcome back to the CCO Follow podcast. Over this past few weeks, we've been talking about parenting, and that's kind of the topic this month. And Travis and I are excited because we're joined today with the Dunnings, Bill and Kathy Dunning. They have some kids, and we're going to be talking specifically today about youth. That's kind of the age range we're going for. And so, Bill and Kathy, I'm curious. Just tell us a little bit about your family and your kids, and we can kind of get started.
Sweet. Yeah. Well, we've got 6 kids. Isn't that right, Kath? Mm-hmm. Yep, 6 kids, and they range in age from 27 to 18 years old. And it's a sweet deal for us. And then the one nuance to that might be that our youngest 2 are adopted, and so that adds a little bit of extra spice
twins,
in our lives.
Which that's a whole other category too.
One more thing, yeah. So we've got twins, and our youngest 2 are adopted. So
nice.
4 boys, 2 girls.
That's awesome. So that, I guess you're right, Travis. It really is. Calvary is really, you have to have 5 kids at least to be in Calvary.
Yep.
So Travis, we're going to be talking a little bit about the youth today, but specifically a couple different things like the independence. I'm looking at my notes here. Larger direction of life, balancing technology. Travis, where do you want to start?
Well, first of all, I just want to start for those of you listening, and you're like, well, they don't have kids who are youth. The youngest is 18. One of the things I'm excited to hear from you guys is that you do have some years removed from your oldest graduating and no longer being in middle school or high school, but you have your most recent who literally just graduated this past school year. And so you do have a certain amount of distance where you can look back and say, oh, that's how we did it then. And maybe that's how we did it, but we wish we would have done it differently, or we're glad we did it a certain way. Because to a certain extent, honestly, parenting is guessing. Like, obviously, praise God, we have the Word of God. It's a light to our path, lamp to our feet. But and we have the wisdom of others. But there's also a certain amount where every kid is different, where all the little micro decisions throughout the day, even kind of the bigger things of how you structure, there's always the big questions of, do you give an allowance or not? Do you give, but you don't call it an allowance? Like, there's always the micro things that you wonder as a parent, like, how is this going to work out for my kid? And so you guys are a little removed from that with some of your kids, to where you can look back and say, this went well, this didn't. This went well with this kid, but not that kid for different reasons. But you're also most recently enough where you're not so far removed where, it's like you've forgotten what it was like parenting a youth, because one of them literally just graduated. Congratulations. So so that's why, for those of you listening, that's why I'm really glad that we have you guys be able to talk about parenting high school, middle school youth. But yeah, we did want to talk some about just the age-specific struggles, because as much as I have my own difficulties with a now 8-year-old, a soon-to-be 6-year-old, and soon-to-be 2-year-old, thankfully they're not asking to borrow the car. They're not asking to. They're asking, but it's an easy no. Yeah. They're not. I'm not struggling right now with certain things that you do struggle with. There's certain things that happen in different stages and ages that is specifically with youth. And so I guess just to kick it off with some of these things, how was it for you guys dealing with this transition where they're kids that are completely dependent on you in every way, to starting to find their own independence, maybe in ways you didn't want? Like, how is that with middle school and high school and parenting, both where you're trying to develop independence for them, but also a certain amount of interdependence where it's like, no, you're still part of this family. Yeah. How was that transition for you guys?
Yeah. You can talk about that.
Yeah. I don't know if you have anything specific in mind, but I really appreciate that you had said about how all the kids are different, because some of them, believe it or not, are actually compliant. And then there's other kids who are just like, they just want to do their own thing. And so having 6 kids, you've got a lot of different personalities and whatever demeanors. And so it's been, it's fresh enough that even though it seems like maybe having a 27-year-old means we might not remember for her, but it's fresh enough that we really do remember. And they are all very different in how they go through and deal with independence. And so I guess maybe my first thought with regards to that is it is so good for them to be independent. I mean, that's really God's design. And, independence allows for us to to be able to exercise faith and take our circumstances and honor God with them. And if we didn't have a measure of independence, we certainly couldn't do those things.
Yeah.
And so as a parent, I think it's really important that we partner well with our kids and understand that actually is the goal, for them to be fully walking with the Lord and on their own in their faith and just following Him. And so with that in mind, I think it sort of sets the stage for how we interact with our kids because we're partnering with them as they grow in independence.
Yeah. Right. I've never thought about independence leaning so much towards faith. Like I always think about independence of like, you can support yourself. You're going to like, rent or own a house without burning it down, like having general life skills. But yeah, in reality, independence really does at its root mean that you developed this child to be able to have dependence on God and have their own vibrant relationship with God.
Yeah, it's a very specific relationship with Jesus. Yeah, that's cool.
What were you going to add to that?
Oh, I was going to say that we kind of developed this mindset of parenting, what we called it, within the funnel. And basically it's just...
you get 6 kids and hopefully end up with 2 at the end.
One of them survives.
No, not quite. So with greater maturity comes greater responsibility. And that's not necessarily based on age. It is truly based on maturity. And maturity would be making the right decision, God-honoring decision when nobody's looking, or not based
when
on
only
performance.
the cameras are looking.
And so that for each child, that funnel width and depth is different.
Interesting.
And it's also flexible.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you're needing to pull back a little bit, you would do that for a season and giving things time limits. Like, okay, we're going to try this new freedom, but let's try it for 3 months and then reevaluate and see where we need to adjust and pull back. And so there's flexibility in that. It can get bumpy and messy. And that, I guess the other thought that looking back is just really enjoying your children and the process through that. And
I'm glad you said that.
It can feel awkward at times, this growing in independence and then pulling back a little bit, but that's okay. And just sort of embrace the awkwardness of it.
And trying to also not beat yourself up of like, oh, we're having to do this again, because I'm sure that there's got to be times where doubt creeps in, or just like, are we doing all this wrong? We're having to backtrack this again. Like, I'm sure there's plenty of times where you just run into doubt and concerns like that.
Well, all I have to do is look as far as myself and how the Lord deals with me. And it's very repetitive. I'm doing it again and again and again. So.
Curious in hopefully not putting you guys too much in a glass fishbowl, so I'm sorry, but without naming names stuff like that, have you ever been in a position where maybe, because your kids aren't super spread out in ages, where did you have to restrict freedom for one where the other one got freedom? And especially if that's a younger one, like how,
what does
if that
look
ever
like?
happened, how did that dynamic work out? How did you do that? Since you do all things well, how did you do that well so it didn't blow up in your face, or like how did that work out?
Or what did you learn from if it didn't go well?
If it blowing up in your face.
But we many times told our kids that we desire to treat you equally, but not the same. And each of them are, stronger or more able to take and move forward in certain areas and others can't. And so they are always measuring and saying, hey, this isn't fair. We're like, well, our goal isn't for you to all be the same.
Life's not
and
fair.
And one thing that was really helpful in working through these kind of issues with the kids has been for them to, with that funnel that Kathy had mentioned, freedom. I always say freedom and responsibility as opposed to maturity. And we would say, we want to give you as much freedom as you take responsibility in this area. And the thing that actually made it a good working tool with the kids is that then they understand what's going on. And, it says in scripture not to exasperate your children. And I think kids are exasperated when they don't understand the rules.
And
And
they don't
so
have something to shoot for. it seems random.
Yeah, totally. And so if you're taking away a freedom, but they don't understand why, then it's frustrating to them and they push back and it creates distance in your relationship. But if they know, hey, we're working towards the same goal, we want you to be ready to handle these things well, and it's always in that context that you have the discussion, then there's not as much frustration. And then when we talk about, hey, you get more freedom here because you're taking responsibility in this area, then they understand what's going on.
Yeah, it's I'm 26 years old, and so I can actually look back on my high school years, and I've mentioned this in the podcast before. I have I have a sister who's 4 years older than I am, and what you're talking about is exactly true. I mean, when my sister is very different than I am, and she would say the same thing, and my parents identified that, and it was difficult at first to, for my sister, she didn't get a cell phone until way later, like in the middle of high school, and I got my cell phone in middle school, and so it was one of those things where my sister was kind of, well, what the heck? Why'd you do that? And the reality was, part of it was my parents just didn't know what they didn't know. And I think that's really difficult to be kind of the first child, is because what Travis was saying at the beginning, it's kind of, you don't know. But they also knew that maybe my sister wasn't the most responsible with stuff. Not to be disparaging in any way, but she'd forget things often, and I was not that way. I'm very like OCD about I need this and this. And so I think there's that level of like, where I even saw it with my parents, where they had to make decisions that maybe weren't always easy, and maybe they didn't know, but ended up like being learning experiences for both me and my sister and for them. So
yeah, I do really like your guys' the funnel responsibility.
Yeah, that's cool.
Having this goal that's in tandem with them. That it's not just, I have this goal for you and it's this thing you don't see. It's like I don't know if you guys went this far, but the way you're talking about it, I feel like they, when growing up, could have said, oh yeah, my parents want me to be able to do X, Y, and Z when I graduate, when I'm old enough. I think it's something really lacking in society. There's the ongoing joke, right, where it's like, we have 18-year-olds in high school who literally are being told they have to raise their hand in class to go use the restroom, but then they're going to graduate in a month and be expected to do like all these adult things. And there's like this jump in responsibility that is just so jarring and unhealthy, because no one can, it's like essentially a tree growing and suddenly expected to bear fruit, but the limbs weren't strengthened at all. It was just like, you're just going to snap the tree in half.
Which would be scary.
Yeah.
to an 18-year-old getting ready just to be on their own. It's like, I'm not ready.
Yeah.
And there actually are a lot of young adults who have a lot of fear they're dealing with because they don't know how they fit in the world.
Yeah. And you pointing out about the like, kind of the angry and despairing your children thing, like that explains why we have so many adolescents acting out, where they're told essentially to do this, but then they try to do that and they're like, get disciplined for it, or they try to show some initiative, but it's like, well, no, not like that. And there's this constant moving target that's not really clear. And it seems like, at least what I'm gathering so far from what you guys are saying, is that there's like clear expectations that are adjusted for each child and is with a goal in mind. It's not just like this abstract, well, we just want you to be more responsible because whatever. It's like, no, we want you to be able to
there's a reason behind doing what we're
And I mean, I can imagine it being more and more important as they get older to have those very blatant conversations where it's just like, this is why, like, my oldest, we can kind of talk like that with him because he's such a logical thinker. He like wants us to talk like that with him. But as they get older, I can only imagine all the more where it's like, this is why, and here's all the reasons so that you understand. You're not just feel like it's just this top down, management says, and so, do it. But yeah.
There's that passage that says it's in Proverbs, without a vision, the people wander.
Yeah.
Or
the people perish.
Yeah.
And I think that's so true in parenting. And I don't want to make it seem like we had everything together and a plan for our kids and they're all on board, because they weren't. But I think that it's so important for them to know that we actually are headed in a certain direction, that they're being taken care of. We're trying to help them arrive at a really good place. because otherwise there's insecurity and there's just not an ability for them to understand that this is all good.
Yeah.
And so it makes a huge difference.
Especially in their mind, they can think of a million reasons why it should be done differently. And so if you don't have a good reason why it should be that way, that does just cause dissonance, like you were saying earlier. It just cause like all the more, obviously they still should obey. That's not giving them license to simply go against, but it's going to certainly be more tempting if they feel like there's not a good reason. And why put that on someone?
Yeah. And it all fits in the context of discipleship too.
Yeah.
And if they know, hey, we're trying to make sure you're in a place where God wants you to be, where you'll be blessed and becoming more like Christ, it's like, okay, there's a reason for all of this.
You mentioned discipleship. That's actually what I wanted to kind of ask you guys. Is you also mentioned how, you look at my parenting, look at how my relationship is with God, and what is it? We're talking about these different ages, and I feel like youth is the age where you're starting to kind of have this self-awareness of yourself, and it can lead to straying away from certain things, especially your parents maybe. And I know in my life I've experienced that. How do you guys I'm curious, how do you guys manage a middle schooler or a high school who is really wanting to kind of separate from you guys, but also remaining disciple makers who are trying to disciple them? What's that like? Is it hard? I'm just curious.
Who's starting? Are you?
Go for it if you.
Well, I would say, just like with the Lord, He wins our hearts. I mean, He loves us. He cares for us, and if we pay attention to what He's told us, it's so clear. And so I'd say the first thing, really, no matter where your kids are, is for them to know that they are in a good place, that they're loved, that they belong in the family, to have a family identity. An identity in Christ. It reminds me actually of, so Pastor John has said many times about the philosophy of the children's ministry is that for the kids to just come and just know that they're cared for, that they're loved, number one. I mean, that's the main thing. And I think it's the same thing for our kids, because if they're starting to go off the rails or something, what tethers them is the relationship.
That's interesting.
And I think to add a layer to that relationship, I read this book by Sean McDowell recently about essentially kind of the raising children in the Lord, and then longevity of life of them having a relationship with Jesus. And one of the things he talked about is he talks to a lot of recently graduated students, especially with Biola and stuff like that. And I forget the context he was asking them, but they got on the subject of the relationship with their parents and stuff. And, majority of them, when asked, do your parents love you? Do your parents care for you? Do your parents want the best for you? All kind of stuff. They all unanimously were like, yes, they do. But there was still this kind of underlying, something's wrong with a lot of the kids who were, that he was talking to. And so he thought to phrase it differently. He said, do your parents like you? And none of them said that their parents liked them. And, love and like is kind of different. Love is very sacrificial, and obviously, there's many different types of love we see in the Bible, and we just have one word. And so as we think in the English word love, we tend to think of sacrificial, we tend to think of feelings, we tend to think of just kind of like almost like obligation sometimes, like your parents have to love you. But for kids to know that they're liked by their parents, that their parents actually like, maybe not all the things they do, just like, we can't, be supportive of every single thing people choose, but they generally like them, that they actually like to spend time with them. They just like them as a person, that they, that there's this additional layer outside of just love. I feel like it's sometimes part of that relational aspect that just needs to really be solidified.
Well, talking about that, the difference between love and like, I kind of think of it like parenting and friend. And I would consider my parents, they're my friends, but they're also my parents. How do you guys deal with I guess it's easy to be a friend, and it's maybe not so easy to be a parent when those parenting times need to happen. How do you guys deal with it? As thinking back in high school, what is it? You have a lot of different kids. I'm just curious, what was it like balancing the being a friend, being liked, and also being a parent when you need to be a parent?
I think for me personally, the real tipping point was, am I willing to just sit and listen and close my mouth and open my ears and just really take in what they're saying and being available. And so I feel like in that respect, sometimes it's so easy to go into automatic parent mode because you've got the wisdom, you've got the advice.
All the wisdom, all the advice.
But it's not necessarily the appropriate time. And
that's a really good point.
And so to slow down, sit back, and just really listen and allow those thoughts and ideas from your child to come forth, I think has been really something that I've needed to practice a lot. And sometimes I mess up, but thankfully through God's grace and my children's grace towards me, we try it again. And I feel like the relationship is much more successful when I am the listener and just receiving what they're saying.
Yeah, that's really good. Really good. So talking about, you have a 27-year-old, so we're kind of the same age, and then you have, an 18-year-old. It's not a ton of time, it's like a decade, but how has technology changed, and how has that changed your parenting styles?
Yeah, it's funny. You asked the question because when you said your sister is 4 years older, is that what you said?
Yeah.
It's like, well, the iPhone hadn't come out yet when she was in middle school or whatever.
Yeah.
So,
did your oldest ever have a pager?
No. Oh. She wasn't a physician. I thought they're the only ones that did. But it's just been so, to us, 56 and 58 on record now. It's just so new, the technology changes. And so we've been through it. But, one context for that, or one thought about that, is the wisdom of my wife. When we got married, she said, would it be okay if we did our first year without a television? And my growing up was like, television is what you do. And so for me, it's like, what? Why didn't you mention this when we were engaged?
I mean, we could. We could, but we're not insane, so.
So Kathy said, can we do that? It's like, okay, yeah, let's try that. And so we pretty much never went back. And so we created this certainly counterculture to the rest of the world.
Totally, very counter.
However, it was huge in developing family identity, the way we spent time together, holding on to values that our family wanted to hold on to, as opposed to opening the door to anybody else's values that wanted to show up on the tube. And it just had a huge impact, and I think it set the stage for how we dealt with technology.
Okay.
You think? Yeah. So we've always felt like technology, at least if we're talking about screen time, was secondary to pretty much everything else in life as opposed to primary. And so we've just ordered our lives that way. And I remember many times our kids, as they grew up, sort of commenting, oh, wow, that family does it differently. Whatever it might be, whether it's technology or food or whatever. Yeah.
That's such a highfalutin way of saying it. I just imagine a 6-year-old being like, Mommy, Daddy, this family does it differently.
No, they were envious. It's like, I remember one of our daughters saying, they have this bread and it's white as opposed to our healthy greeny bread. Or one of our sons saying, I overheard him whispering to our older daughter, it's like, did you know that some families do things differently? And so just as they came to realize it's totally humorous, but we would talk about, why it is and what we're doing. And I think it's really gone a long way in preserving our kids as far as Christian values, Christ-like, values, and their perspective as they've grown up. Totally. And so it's important to not have it be that way until they turn 18. And like you were saying, Travis, then suddenly they're out in the world and like, okay, this is so different that they fall apart. Yeah,
you don't want them to be Amish, but you also want to make sure you're doing things in a way that actually lends towards the disciple-making process.
Yeah, and
takes away from
your reasoning behind it, right? It's like you explain to them, hey, this is why we do it. And so when they are free and out of the house, it's they have the reason behind it, and it's not just, oh, well, this rule doesn't apply to me anymore, I'm just going to go do this. I think that's really important. That's a really cool way to go about that.
Yeah, the kind of dangerous thing about technology, I think, just if you just look at it as a whole, is that in general, technology takes normal things. Like you said, it was secondary. Like in many ways, technology just takes average everyday things and kind of just like just explodes it to 1,000. You know, you have movies, which for the most part, movies are based off of reality. Like obviously there's fantastical natures of them, but they're the exact same kind of things that kids would play pretend in. But now it's exemplified to 100. You know what I mean? You have texting and stuff like that, which is just us talking, but now it's exemplified to, you can do it with hundreds of people, and it just takes everyday things and makes them just explodes them out. And so I like how you kind of said that, you know, it takes secondary, because all it does is mimic real life, but it does it in a very addicting, very non-real way, all at once way, where it takes things that are naturally good, but it just kind of like it doesn't even morse them, it just kind of like intensifies them.
It does, but it also moves you from being a participant in life to being a spectator. And so much of it you're watching somebody else do it, which is crazy. I remember watching our kids watching other kids on YouTube playing games. It's like, what?
Which, I mean, how different is that than us all watching football? But, you know.
And that's what I was going to talk about next.
But, you know, I have heard of some parents taking the route of like, you're allowed to use technology to create, but not to consume. And obviously, I'm not trying to say this is a hard fast rule and everyone should, but in that same vein, it's like, like, how can we use technology? And even if that is in a consumption way, how do we use that in a healthy consumption way, both in quantity and in quality and in just, you know, all the factors, because it does just take everything in our real life and just expand on it.
I think it was easier for me, just my age. For me, when technology, I feel like that's when technology was really starting to ramp up. You know, the iPhone came out when, like, just before I got to high school. And so there wasn't this, like, nowadays, like, pretty much every social media app is just consumption. But before, it was like, oh, they're tools, like you can play different kind of games on them, or you can, like, you know, create like art on them and all these different things, and even video games. I played video games. I think I had an Xbox 360, all this stuff. But the way my parents went about like showing me that and basically parenting me in that is they didn't disallow it, but they put very like constrained guidelines and framing around it, so that, you know, I was only allowed to play for a certain amount of hours a day, you know, only at this specific time. And they would tell me like the reason why. And sometimes I would just be like, oh, that's dumb. But as I got older, I realized how valuable that was, as I was seeing my friends who would they'd spend all their time on this. And it's like, and I would realize that, man, like, even if I did that, I would feel like physically not well. That would like cause, and so it was like all these different things that my parents had introduced me to slowly over time. You know, now I have free access, but it's like you're saying, like, I don't choose to do it this way. I choose to use it for something else. And I think I just think it's really important. That's kind of the tip that we're really focusing on right now, is just being very like partnering with your kids, but explaining these things in a way that is easy to understand. Yeah, which, I mean, all your kids now do have smartphones. I believe none of them have opted not to.
This is true.
Yeah. They'll have a smartphone. I know at least with the young adults at our church, a lot of them have gravitated more to social media stuff like Be Real, where it's not as scroll addicting. It's not as fantastical as far as, you know, the classic like Instagram like and fake life and fake stuff. Yeah. Obviously, you can get that anywhere. You can get that literally anywhere. But how was that transition for you guys with allowing them to have their first smartphone, allowing them to get their first social media account? What kind of, and again, we're not trying to use you guys as like okay, do this and everything will be fine. But like, I guess you guys talked about the funnel of having freedom with responsibility, and sometimes you had to tighten it back up, sometimes you were able to loosen it, but always also there was a goal of, we want them to end up here. How is that with technology? And maybe since it's such an easy, accessible thing, how was that with cell phones and social media? In what ways when did you start allowing some freedom? And like you guys mentioned earlier, it wasn't always age-based. It was based on each kid. So what developmental things did you see before you started allowing cell phones, before you started allowing social media, and what ways maybe did you have to pull back and then let loose again? Like how did all that go?
Yeah, certainly it had to be after puberty. I'm just kidding. Do you have any thoughts initially?
Well, I suppose with the cell phone, I mean, it was a little bit age based in that, well, each of our kids decided to get their driver's license right away. So that was
so it was almost
likely,
like a safety thing than
So that was the likely time that they were able to get a cell phone for safety and GPS and all those things.
Yeah.
So that was a perfect opportunity to start.
Yeah.
And I know that may sound shocking to a lot of people because that is 16 and that's significantly later than many of their peers.
How was that dealing with raising youth when people had different expectations? I was saying they were doing anything wrong, but how was that? Like, how did you manage those conversations when they knew you were going to say like no until 16?
Mom, Dad, this family over here has given a cell phone to their kid.
You have to start early for sure. It sort of fits into the funnel discussion because we'd been talking to our kids about giving them freedom as they have as they take on responsibility and as they're ready for a long time. And so it wasn't a surprise. And I think that for the most part, amazingly, they were okay with the decision. But they were certainly intrigued. And when they would go over to a friend's house, it's like, okay, all bets off or whatever. And I also don't want to make it seem like we're against technology. And I know you know that we're not. But or for anybody that's listening to think that we're against technology. We think it's amazing. It's great. It's just that like anything else in life, it can be misused.
Totally.
Yeah. And maybe it's just easier to also be misused. Yeah,
exactly. And so we didn't want to stop our kids from technology. We wanted them to make good choices. And so I think just as maybe taking a step back, then there's certain values that go into the decisions that we make.
Yeah.
And you had talked about consuming media or whatever it might be. And you sort of develop a culture by habits to help to contribute towards culture and a way of thinking. And with, I remember going to a family event and all of the cousins who hadn't been together for years were all looking at their phones at the same time as they're sitting in this room. There's like 10 of them and they hadn't been together for years. It's like, what are you guys doing? I mean, I didn't say that out loud, but they're just all consuming on their phone instead of enjoying relationship. And it's because that's what they had been patterning.
Yeah. And that actually brings up something that's definitely not in our notes. I just thought of this right now.
Cut the recording.
But what I was thinking about is I notice, just even with myself, there's certain things like not defense mechanisms, but like coping mechanisms that I've developed that maybe are definitely not the healthiest. But like if I'm at like a family gathering, I can totally see like, oh, if you're awkward, if it's like you don't really know them, I was like, I'm just go on my phone.
I mean, it's comforting just feeling the rectangle in your pocket.
So I just think that's a huge thing. So I think it's a good thing what you guys have done, because in a way you can help teach the good ways of dealing with that uncomfortableness and all these things. Do you have any examples of that? I know I just asked that question out of thin air, but if you have any examples, what are like how do you teach the good ways of coping or the good ways of doing this over, maybe letting people figure it out, but in a bad way? I don't know. Does that make sense? I don't know if that's
great.
It's kind of a weird question, but
I think Moussier, hopefully he doesn't mind us using his name.
All about you, Moose.
But he
would agree with that.
He kind of came up with the policy he did of doing a phone stack if we're out anywhere. So when we go to a restaurant or something,
that's cool.
Everybody stacks their phone in the middle of the table, and then it's everybody's phones is in that place, and nobody's going to be looking at it. And so I appreciate that, and I think that he's kind of initiated that with some of his friends getting together and things like that.
I think that's one really like hopeful thing is just as the pendulum swings one direction, it does tend to swing back. And we have seen just like societally people who are now the ages of like 16 to 23 being more sensitive to like how destructive so many of these things are, to where there's definitely a large segment of them who are recognizing that's why Be Real has become so popular. It's why those kind of things, I've seen that with younger people far more than older people. People my age down to Arthur's, I haven't seen doing anything like that, where they just stack all their phones together, unless they do it as an actual game. Like a friend of mine joked recently, like, oh, let's stack it, and then whoever gets the phone call first pays for the meal. Like, but to do it as a no, we want to actually spend time together, and that's the main purpose of this, not as a gag or anything. That's coming from people who are younger, because they're looking at people slightly older than them and going like, that didn't work out well for them, I don't want that.
But you know how genuine relationships are a big deal now, and I'm probably saying that wrong, whatever the term is, but authentic relationships. And I think that, to answer your question, Arthur, I think that as our kids grew up and they developed habits that were healthy, of wanting to relate to others and have real conversations and all those things, then they are introduced to their phone and screen time, and they realize more quickly, like, oh, our friends are not doing that. They're just totally consumed by their phones. And so developing good habits and good values up front is essential. And the earlier you give your child the opportunity to not do that, the more you disable them for success later.
Yeah.
Which I think it also points out the reminder of try to make sure you curate your kids' friends as much as you can. I mean, to a certain extent you can't, but there's little things you can do, and they are going to be much more like their friends than you want. And so if their friends are doing certain things, they're more likely to go that way.
And I'm curious, kind of to put that side by side here. We were talking before we started, and you mentioned riding loose in the saddle, and I'm curious, what did you mean by that, and how do you go about doing that?
How do you do that without falling off?
Well, I love to cycle, and so whatever terrain I'm on, if I know that it's going to be a bumpy terrain, I will sit or I'll position myself differently than if it's a smooth ride. And I feel like the youth years can be a little bumpy. And so rather than reacting and jarring to every impact and bump, if you're riding a little loosely, there's that kind of give and take a little bit. It's less stressful. I think, as a parent, and also on the child. And so that's what I mean by riding loosely, not necessarily reacting to every jolt that's coming along, taking the long range view of something and looking at, taking the long range view and looking at something as this is a process over time. And we'll be revisiting it many, many times.
Can you give an example? What are the jolts or the jarring?
She gave a great biking analogy. Is that not enough for you?
The analogy's awesome. I'm just thinking, what would be a good example of that?
Yeah. Well, I think going back to the listening aspect, when you, maybe on the inside, when my kids are telling me something, on the inside I'm thinking, oh, but I'm not reacting that way outside, and I'm panicking on the inside, but not on the outside.
Don't let them know. Keep it cool.
Just to keep those lines of communication open. I won't divulge anybody's secrets, but just.
I think it's out of fear too that we often panic and respond poorly. As a parent, we're afraid that things are going to go wrong.
Yeah, totally. Well, and you're worried about what that is going to reflect on you and what people are going to think of you and who you are as a person because of how your kids turn out. So it can also become a lot of pride and almost self-preservation when you're parenting, which is not a healthy place to parent from.
I feel like you're reading my soul.
But, something I was thinking of when you were just talking about the, not letting not trying to harp on every single thing, but taking the long game, stuff like that, is maybe think about how relationships in general are kind of built on this foundation of trust. And you may have heard the analogy before that, like, you're either making a deposit or withdrawal in a relationship. And I think so often when we think about parenting, we're thinking of the withdrawals, we're thinking of the corrections, we're thinking of the redirecting, we're thinking of the, all those pieces. And we have to make sure that when we're parenting, we're not making more withdrawals than we are deposits, and deposits of showing them that we love them, showing them that we like them, showing them that we, investing so that they feel trust so we can make those withdrawals. And I think, part of the reason what you're saying is so important is that if you do allow every single bump to become a withdrawal instead of allowing it to just be like, I'm taking the long game, you might totally overdraw. And then especially this age where they have the ability to say, you know what, I'm just going to stop listening to you. It's a dangerous game to over withdraw. I mean, it's dangerous to over withdraw in any relationship, but specifically one where they easily can just say, you know what, and they're more prone to biologically at this age to just be like, I'm going to stop listening to mom and dad. You need to make sure that you're depositing more than you're withdrawing. And part of that's done by just not withdrawing as often, by saying, okay, this isn't as big of a deal. I need to take the long game and make sure that I'm, going this direction overall and not allowing these things to slip up and cause me to overdraw.
Well, it's what you were saying too. I think the best thing to think about is, a relationship is not, like, relationships don't work under control. They work under trust. And it's a two-way street. And I just think, what you guys have said overall and just parenting and your tips and stuff, it really is about the relationship. And it kind of, as we end and close out, just one last little thing I want to kind of touch on and ask is just this idea of like first, what's the purpose of parenting? Like, why? Like, what's the end goal? And I think I know the answer, what you're going to say, but I'm just curious, what is the end goal? And then how do we, just one little tip of like how to get there? And I think we've talked about it, but I just want to cover it.
I think the answer is grandchildren.
Okay. Maybe
just a joke. Just a joke.
Is it?
Which we do have one.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah. To raise godly offspring, right? To honor the Lord with these little lives, and is certainly my goal or purpose. Anyways.
Yeah. One thing Arthur doesn't really necessarily go with exactly what you were asking, but a thought came to my mind a little earlier about, in this time of riding loose in the saddle and this taking the long range is also not getting caught up in immediately rescuing our children or covering for them. And that kind of goes back to that fear thing of, oh, my kid messed up, and so now I'm going to come in and I'm going to make excuses for them, and I'm going to kind of diffuse the situation. And I think that it's been really valuable for us to kind of sit in the moment, dwell in the oops, in the mistakes, and grieve through that process of, that was hard and that was difficult. Now what do we do about it? Rather than coming in and rescuing and just making it go away, because that's not going to set them up for future disappointments and things that will kind of test them. And so that's a learning process that we've had to go through, of really being able to sit with your kids in the mistake, in the hardships, rather than rescuing.
It's a process as kids, as they're really young, you're their authority. And then as they get older, you become more of a coach. And then the goal, like you were saying about your family, I think, is being friends. It's just such a sweet relationship to develop. But I think that sometimes we try to be friends too early. And I've seen a lot of parents, and I've done it myself, where I'm willing to sort of sacrifice values because I'm afraid of losing the relationship. And that's no friend and no coach. And a poor authority. And so just the importance really in order to do just what Kathy had said and to walk through hard times with them, you have to know where you're at and what you're trying to accomplish, so that you do it well. And the goal being for them to be independent followers of Christ means that you have to coach them through those things and to what the maximum extent possible to allow them to be to bring out and be the solution to the problem they've created. So they have natural consequences, and then they have to walk through resolving it instead of, like Kathy said, rescuing them.
Yeah, that's great.
And I think the instinct reaction to go in and rescue them and fix it, although it may not initially come across like, I think that is a withdrawal in the relationship, because it's telling them, you're not good enough, I'm just going to fix it. You can't, like, I'm, you know what I mean? Like, I think it's a withdrawal where what you're saying of like taking the time to just be with them in it is actually a deposit, because it shows like, it shows I'm not abandoning you. I'm not, I'm here, and it being fixed is less important to me than you. Because I think it's sometimes the message we can get across too, where it's like, I honestly don't care about you. I just don't want this thing to be ruined. And, I'll never forget, like John has told the story multiple times, the first time Caden mowed the lawn, and how he did his best, but it wasn't great. And he was planning on telling him, hey, you did a great job. Here's 2 areas you could do better, trying to emphasize the training part and all that kind of stuff. And was preparing this speech to be both encouraging but instructive. And he felt that as Caden was coming back to see him, he felt like I was telling him, like, you're growing kids, not grass. And he just felt in that moment he should just tell him, you did awesome, not give him any instruction, and just be like, you did great, we're gonna keep doing this. And just leave it there. And I think there's times where we need to remember that continual depositing, and make sure that we're molding kids, not fixing problems. Because they're 2 very different goals, and they give 2 very different messages to the kids.
I love it. Thank you guys so much for having this conversation with us. Travis, thank you again, and thank you so much for listening and watching. We've really learned a lot, and we're still learning a lot about parenting. And again, super appreciate it, you guys. Thanks for coming on and giving your experience. Next week, we're going to be talking about the next kind of age, which is emerging adults, which you guys are also experts in. But
we'll have a different couple.
Yeah, we'll have a different couple. And so thank you so much for joining us. And we just encourage you to continue to join us and follow us, and just really being a part of this. This isn't just an us thing. It's a community thing. And so thank you again for watching and listening. And as always, God bless.